I am Heather Miller Rubens. I'm the Executive Director as well as the Roman Catholic Scholar of the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. I'm delighted to be here with you today as we talk about Preaching Goes Viral, Tracking Religious Responses to COVID-19 with Dr. Hillel Gray and some of his students also from Miami University of Ohio. We're delighted to welcome you all to Zoom today. I want to talk a little bit about format and logistics for this. ICJS is a dialogue organization, and so we usually have a lot of conversation. This is going to be a little bit more of a webinar format. And so all of the participants are going to be muted for the program. That's also to help with sound in this medium. And hopefully you will see the active speaker when he or she is talking. The chat feature is going to be open though and live. And so we're encouraging everyone to participate in the chat box and to put your questions in the chat box. Some of the staff is going to keep an eye on that and try to collate questions as they come in. If it's a large and rambunctious crowd, we may have too many questions that we can get to today, but please just put them there and look and see what other people are thinking about. So now I'm going to slide into sort of personal introductions, and then we'll get started on the conversation. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Hillel Gray, who is a scholar of religion and ethics with primary interest in Jewish legal discourse and in the study of oppositional religious groups. He is currently an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Comparative Religion at Miami University of Ohio, affiliated with the Middle East Jewish and Islamic Studies program. This past academic year, Dr. Gray introduced an innovative course at Miami University called Empathy and the Religious Enemy. The course comes out of Dr. Gray's decades-long ethnographic style study through in-person and recorded interviews of controversial religious groups, namely the Westboro Baptist Church and the Neturei Karta. Through this approach, Gray pursues a non-biased, empathetic discipline to interview and engage with an oppositional other. Gray is training others, including students and scholars, to employ this research approach as a means to encourage meaningful conversations with polarizing communities, without validating or condoning their actions or their beliefs. His work resonates well with the mission of ICJS and indeed can even inspire us to go further in our engagement with difference. Hillel and I have been colleagues and friends for 17 years. And I was thinking in preparation for today about a sort of a distinctive memory that I have of Hillel in graduate school. And I wanted to share it with you before we begin the conversation. So we were Brower Fellows together in the spring of 2003. And in this intensive seminar environment, Hillel stood out as someone not only as a creative thinker, asking the most challenging questions, both inside and outside the classroom, but as one of the most compassionate and curious people that I had the pleasure of learning with at Chicago. And importantly, I'd like to end this introduction by sharing a brief story. Hillel stands out from my memories of grad school, particularly this seminar, because he ended the seminar with a 45-minute in-class presentation that he did entirely in rhyming poem. He also, if I'm remembering correctly, had a light costume on while he delivered his final presentation in poetic style. And so I just hope that you get to see both the joy of learning with Hillel today, and as well as his seriousness of his thought and his capacious compassion. I also want to introduce two students from Miami University of Ohio, but I think there may be more on the call as well, who are joining us for the discussion of this project. The first is Alexa Lawhorn, who's a junior at Miami University and majoring in history and comparative religion. Alexa has worked on the Empathy and Religious Enemy project since the spring of 2019. And for this Preaching Goes Viral initiative, she has been a key player. This summer, she hopes to continue her historical research and study primitive Baptist responses. The other student I wanted to highlight is Veronica Domke, who's an incoming junior at Miami University studying biology with a co-major in pre-medieval studies. She has done previous research on the Westboro Baptist Church and the Preaching Goes Viral initiative. Her role in this internship will focus primarily on redesigning the future Religion 101 courses at Miami University and continuing her research with the Primitive and Westboro Baptist churches. As a member of the Preaching Goes Viral team, she's excited to see this database expand. So again, your mics are off, the chat is open. Hopefully you will go into it. And we're now going to start talking with Hillel and his students about this project. So I'd like to begin our conversation with an observation. As of this morning, 99,264 Americans have died of COVID-19 since the beginning of the year. The immensity of this tragedy and its impact and our capacity to make sense of it holistically is actually beyond the capacities of us right now, because we are living through it. I think that one of the most productive ways that we can reckon with this ongoing disaster is by creating a record for the future. According to historian Janice Hume, who is the author of Obituaries in American Culture, we will only truly understand this pandemic once it is over. Many years from now, historians will look to archival projects like Preaching Goes Viral to help tell the complex story of our time. And specifically, your archive, Hillel, will help us understand the depth and diversity of religious responses to coronavirus. So can you talk a little bit about what Preaching Goes Viral is trying to collect? What do you think this collection, this archive is important? And then how are you involving students?
Thank you for a wonderful introduction. And it's great to see so many people here. Great to see students here, former students here, relatives here. It's a lot of fun. We started this in mid-March, and we basically did not draw any kind of boundary on the kind of materials we want to collect. So we're focused on primary sources more than secondary sources. We're not trying to collect newspaper clippings or TV news reports about it. We're mostly trying to collect material from religious groups themselves or from religious individuals. So we have both official and unofficial materials. So an official materials might be like a sermon from a member of the clergy or a pronouncement by a church or a synagogue or a mosque about why they're closing or why they're not closing. But we also have an openness to, say, blog posts or any kind of religious commentary, a personal journal. One of my students got an invite to a ritual circumcision, and she had a nice, like a postcard invite to a Zoom circumcision. So any kind of material would be useful. I think what's compelling now is to try to gather material that's more ephemeral, that is not going to be up online or available very far into the future. So for instance, if you get a live stream, a lot of the live streams are being cycled through, they're being lost. It'd be great to get copies of those as well. We're aware of all sorts of new rituals that are being developed or adjusted rituals. We're trying to get copies of those. We'd like to see contributions of prayers, of hymns, all sorts of materials. There was a bit of a debate in our class. Of course, I'm in the Midwest. I don't know if anybody in the Midwest has heard of de Blasio, but apparently he's the mayor of New York or something. But he put out this tweet that was very controversial about ultra-Orthodox Jews, and maybe Ben Sachs can give a little context for this. But my students were saying, well, this is about religion and the pandemic. Should we be including this? It's not that he was making a religious statement, but it is a primary source. So we do want to document this historical moment, this unfolding of a crisis before our eyes. And I think there are a lot of different ways to do that. And I don't know that I can imagine all the different kinds of contributions.
So what did you and your students decide about the de Blasio tweet?
I left it up to the students. I assume that Clay put it up there, but I'm not sure I've ever checked. But we do have some news reports, some journalistic material in there as well that would certainly cover it. We also set up what's called the Zotero site. And so we're collecting the secondary materials that way, secondary literature. So at one point I can give you the link to the Zotero site. I put the word up there.
So why do you think the act of archiving religious responses to coronavirus is important?
Well, the thing that we might assume sometimes is that when you're in the middle of a crisis, everybody sort of pulls together and holds hand, and they're more harmonious, and you sort of think everybody will work together. And my impression is that's not the case, that there's still lots of polarization, lots of divisiveness, and that for some people, it might be unifying, but for many people, it's an opportunity for greater fracture or greater conflict. And I think we want to be able to learn about that. We want to be able to see what's going on, see what's happening. So the crisis amplifies a lot of phenomena that we're trying to study, that people want to learn from. I don't think it's only of historical value, like way down the road. People are in the middle of this crisis now, and it's spreading to other continents. Other continents are experiencing the kind of hotspots we saw in, say, northern Italy a while ago, right? So there's a lot to be learned now about how communities are responding, and the religious communities tend to be on the sort of cutting edge of all sorts of responses, whether they are public service and trying to feed the poor, or whether they're standing up against government orders or against government guidance for public health.
To follow up a little bit on this last comment, I would agree with you that we're experiencing this pandemic in a climate of polarization. I mean, people are responding to the coronavirus through competing political, ideological, and religious frameworks, religious worldviews. And so I'm actually curious about how the Preaching Goes Viral archival project has been received. Like, have there been any barriers or obstacles to collection? Have people been suspicious, saying kind of, what are you doing collecting religious responses? Why are you collecting this response? Or like challenged you or your methods?
You know, I wish we were out there enough to really get more challenges. But, you know, I have seen some responses where I think, you know, I'm an academic, I'm approaching stuff from what I think is a critical distance. I'm not trying to judge any of the religious groups or religious responses, but I think when I put out the name Preaching Goes Viral, people tend to think that we're favoring religion. And so I get a lot of pushback from people who are anti-religious in particular. And then sometimes we get pushback from particular religious people who feel like we're going to be telling them what they should believe instead of, you know, them telling us what to believe.
And then are you actively seeking people to submit things to you, or are you also collecting sort of without permission is probably a more harsh way of putting it, but are you kind of looking in the public domain and trying to capture things actively?
Sure, we're doing both. So we have, as we'll show people, we have a form for people to submit. So people can submit their own stories, their own materials, or materials that they're getting from their religious communities, or materials that they write themselves or from their friends. But we're also out there searching ourselves throughout the internet for materials. We just got told today that my university, which I'm sort of excited about, has found a grad student who's going to be helping us more on this. We already have one intern from the University of Texas who's helping us. So we do have a growing team of people who are out there trying to search for materials. We have, I think, on the order of about 3,000 items now, but there are probably, you know, many hundreds of thousands of items that we could be collecting.
So the Preaching Goes Viral project, I know, sits currently under your larger umbrella project of Empathy and the Religious Enemy. And I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that project and its relationship between the two, and maybe just give us a little hint of your other research interests.
Sure, if you want. I mean, I started that about 10 years ago. I got very interested in, I was working at the Emory Center for Ethics, and I was very interested in the kinds of religious groups that people tend to mock or ridicule or dislike or dismiss. And so I started to do work on these oppositional or radical religious groups. And it's actually fairly timely because I've now been working on a radical anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox group in New York. And that's an area that was very hard hit by the pandemic and was also subject to anti-Semitic attacks. People remember on the Festival of Hanukkah that there was a stabbing in that neighborhood, in the neighborhood that I study. So the thing that I'm working on is trying to understand religious people that most of us tend to dismiss or just can't imagine, like can't wrap our heads around. How do they say these kinds of things? And I think the same thing you see now in this crisis. You know, like there are churches that are insisting on being open, and so many people are like shocked, like how can you be open when the government is telling you that it's unsafe? And so many people that I see are just really angry, and they can't wrap their heads around these groups. And so I'm asking for people to sort of step back and be able to understand their perspective, and also to have some empathy, to try to understand them as human beings, try to understand their emotional lives and where they're coming from. And I think the way you do that in a lot of ways is to really encounter people in person, which I have to say is not the easiest thing to do right now with all the physical separation that we're doing.
I was wondering if we could maybe hear from your students, Veronica and Alexa. I don't know if you could unmute yourselves.
Sure, you want to ask them a question, or you want to
I wanted to hear about their involvement with the project, sort of what got you interested in it, what have you been doing, and what are your hopes for the project?
Last semester, when the pandemic started, I was doing an independent study with Dr. Gray, and it lent itself extremely well to just switch over to COVID response. And what I did was I went through scholarly articles about past religious responses to pandemics and natural disasters. And what I found was that a lot of these articles were saying it was so hard to find materials from certain religious groups. And I was really interested in that because the database is trying to, like, what we're trying to do is create a database that has these responses and that historians can go to in the future and look back and actually have those resources instead of struggling to find them. So, yeah.
That's great. And Veronica?
What got me interested in early March when we made the switch was that I feel like a lot of students felt like we had no control over what was happening in our lives. It all happened very quickly, and soon we were being, pushed off campus. So when Dr. Gray offered us the option of switching from the original coursework to Preaching Goes Viral, a lot of students were on board. Originally, we did it by picking a state or a zip code and finding churches there online and then going to their websites and gathering bibliographic information so that we could contact them, asking them for sermons related to Corona, or find their live streams or pre-recorded messages online. During the semester, what I was most interested in was finding what people blame or think the virus was caused by. So that was interesting for me. Yeah, I hope to see the various different perspectives, and that's my goal.
That's great. I wanted to shift back over to the sort of second half of our conversation. So we've kind of had that sort of 30,000 foot why archive? Why is it important to collect things? How are you collecting things? What's the sort of goal of this? I'm seeing some questions come in. Let me take a quick glance at those and see if we should sort of take a moment for questions before going to the sort of second half of our presentation today, which is going to be the how can you participate? How can you submit part?
Yeah, these are some great questions. I don't know if Abby, if you want to ask yours, or Pat Fossarelli, or Jane Walsh. I don't know, there's quite a few interesting questions here.
I'll read some.
Okay, that's a good way to do it.
And let Hillel, you respond. And then if Alexa or Veronica, if you want to chime in as well, just sort of wave and we'll unmute you. Is the project interested in materials directed at children and teens? They will be the adults of the future, and unfortunately, when another pandemic occurs.
So you mean like children's books, for instance, or writings for children? Sure, that would be great.
Or children's liturgy, I think, Dr. Fossarelli.
Sure, that would be great. Again, we don't really have a limit on the material we're trying to collect. So if it's controversial, that's fine. If it's middle of the road, it's fine. If it's very creative and idiosyncratic, that's fine as well. If it's very standard liturgy that is somehow adapted, my Judaism class gathered a lot of materials that had to do with Passover, because Passover came in somewhat during the beginning of the pandemic here in the US. So sure, that kind of material would be great.
You mentioned, this is another question from another participant, you mentioned spread to other continents, and obviously this is a worldwide pandemic. Are you interested in materials in various languages, and how are you addressing matters of translation?
Great question. So yes, I would love to get international materials. We have one of our interns this summer is a Brazilian scholar or undergraduate scholar who's has to be back in Brazil. He's at the University of Chicago, your alma mater, and he's studying Brazilian Pentecostal charismatics. So that's an example. We have another intern who's hoping to study religious groups in Jamaica. I recently sent her a sort of very fiery church speech from down there. So we're open to all sorts of materials. I think somebody asked me about material in Hebrew. So if there's material in Israel or from other Jewish authors or Jewish speakers, that would be great. I think we're moving to a new website where we have a collaboration with George Mason University, and they're giving us an installation for a public interface. And I think it will have a lot of capacity to cover languages. And my students are doing a lot of analysis, or I'm encouraging students and interns to do a lot of analysis. And we now have a new program that does a lot of transcription almost instantaneously of video or audio files, at least into English. And so, so that's going to make their analytical work a lot easier. And I'm also going to be encouraging, again, most of my students are going to be English-speaking people, but you can go to Australia, New Zealand, UK, and so on for those kind of materials. Oh, and tomorrow, I'm so excited about this actually. Tomorrow, we're meeting with, I haven't met this person, but somebody who left the Satmar community, the community sort of made famous by the Unorthodox Netflix show, and is going to be helping us do a Yiddish translation of some of the Satmar writings. And I think this will be interesting because I believe the Satmar rabbi or chief clergy person had a particular position at one point and then got ill and adjusted their position on it. And so with a Yiddish translator, I think we'll be able to see some of that change. And one of the things that we're trying to do is use this material for pedagogy. And nowadays in the academy, the study of religion, one of the major points of focus is to be able to show people historical change, right? Many religious people would say, you know, we have the religion the way it's always been. You know, Jesus said this, and we're looking at things the same way. So when we could show these little micro changes or adaptations during the pandemic, I think that will be a very powerful teaching tool.
Going forward with the analysis question, another participant asked, will you be doing any analysis of the information and sources being archived? It sounds like you and your students are doing that as you go, but it'd be nice to elaborate a little bit more about that. And then will this archive be publicly available in any way?
What I'm showing you here is a screenshot from a program called Deduce, which is a multi-user online qualitative data analysis tool. So what my students have done is they've started to what's called code or categorize the data that's being put in. At this point, we had about 2,000 records and about 500 media files in the system. And they would go through and they would code the material for different themes or different analytical points. it shows you the codes here, but here's a sort of a better picture of some of the codes that they were using. So I believe, Veronica, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, were you the one focused on blame who or what for the virus? Was that one of your themes?
Yes, I focused on blame and punishment.
Right. So when you were doing your coding, you would look at a particular, say, a sermon, and you might find your code there, but you would also enter in other codes that you would notice. So she might find an example of them talking about whether the pandemic is a sign of the apocalypse or not. Okay. So when she looked at that sermon, she would code it that way. And another student who's studying the apocalyptic aspect would find that paragraph that she noted. Does that make sense? So there was both analysis by the students beginning this way, and also a sort of a collaborative sharing through this system. I could show you a little bit more, but maybe we should have more questions about this.
I think we might save some of the other kind of submission questions and analysis questions for when you kind of walk people through that process. If that,
okay.
So let's go back. There's a couple of great questions coming in.
Super.
Are you interested in audience responses to preaching? So if a sermon goes out and the congregation or somebody in the community responds to a sermon, are you looking to collect that as well?
That's really interesting. So are you talking about you, for instance, are a member of an audience and you would write up your response? Or a blog post that would be a response?
Yeah, this is coming from one of the members of the audience, so I don't want to.
Yeah, I think that's totally valid. I think that would be very interesting. I mean, it would be good if we had a consistent set of information of that type and a consistent way to gather that. But either way, I think to start to get some of that material, I noticed that when I showed some people a clip that I might show you as well today if we have time, of a preacher, and people could sort of hear in the background of the audio the people in the pews, and people were wondering whether they were hearing like applause or booing. You know, so when we get these live audio tapes, you know, some of them will be interesting. Now, a lot of them are pretty flat because it's just the preacher speaking to an empty room at that point. But yeah, it's the response from the community is really, I think, something that we want to be able to see more documentation of.
Are you doing, this is another participant question, are you doing or will you be doing any interviews with religious leaders?
No, I would say we're not doing that. So this is not an ethnographic study. The people we're studying are not being treated as human subjects. We're not being supervised by an IRB. And so we're not raising those kind of ethical issues. We're trying to develop a digital archive of materials. It could be various kinds of documents, photographs, images, drawings, video, and so on. We're hoping to submit this eventually, along with our partners, to the Library of Congress and have it be one of their permanent data collections. So we're not planning at this point to do any ethnographic interviews. I'm not sure what more I should say about that. I mean, I know people who are doing interviews. I'm on a panel with the Association of Jewish Studies, I hope in the winter. And there is a guy in Toronto, for instance, doing ethnographic interviews, and I'm going to be responding to his work. There's a woman in Israel now who's studying, do you want to guess what she's studying, or should I just tell you?
I think you should tell us.
She's studying Jews on their porches. So Jews are coming out on their porches in crowded areas of Jerusalem, and they're praying together, from the distance of, house to house or floor to floor. And I don't know if they're able to put together what's called a minyan, a group of 10 men or not, to be able to pray together. But she's doing a whole ethnography around people during the pandemic on their porches.
And then there's another question I want to bring up at this point. There's two participant questions that are kind of a piece. How are you handling responses to Donald Trump within the COVID context with religious leaders? So when religious leaders are engaging in Trump and Trump's responses to coronavirus, another framing of this question, how does President Trump's response to the pandemic influence various religious communities' responses? And how would you go about analyzing that?
So the first thing that we're trying to do is gather the information, collect the data, right? As we collect the data, we're trying to find the points of intersection, for instance, with President Trump. So if you look at what's on my screen here, about halfway down, there's a code called Politicians, Religion, and the Pandemic, right? So when my students were finding this, these examples of a preacher or a document referring to President Trump, they would use that code. And I think as we go through, we'll, at least with the transcribed and text files, we could search for particular names. So if a student or a scholar wants to come into the archive and study Trump in particular, they could search for Trump. So the Preaching Goes Viral project in itself is not going to issue like a fiat of a statement about President Trump, but we're going to make space for students, you know, I'm a teaching professor, and other scholars to come and do the kind of research you're talking about. And so certainly in the United States, the engagement of Donald Trump with the whole pandemic and religious groups with him or against him, that's major, that's big.
I want to kind of shift to the next part of our call today, which is the how can you participate part. I think one of the most exciting parts of this project is the fact that you are asking for help from the general public. I know in recent years, there's been an increase in public science initiatives that ask sort of regular people to help gather data for research. I know personally, my family has participated in the Audubon Society's Great Backyard Bird Count for several years, which is always a lot of fun. I see kind of what you're doing as a kind of public religious history project.
Yeah.
When you're asking for our help in collecting religious responses to coronavirus. So let's kind of move our conversation into how everyone on this call can become public religious historians with you.
Right, so yeah, it's sort of a kind of a crowdsourcing. I heard one recently was sourdough. I think the one that I would like to do is the one where they're trying to figure out the digits of pi. So I could tell them that the first digit I think is 0.1, and so you guys could go from there. I'm incredibly funny, but I see that nobody's laughing on the screen here. Okay. Anyway, here's the landing page. If you go to enemyempathy.com, you'll get to this landing page, and it explains the Preaching Goes Viral initiative. It gives an example of some of the controversies, how we started, and how you can help. And then if you click on this image, or if you click here, you'll get to the page that is the, is it this one? You'll get to this page here, which is where you would enter the data. So you'd click here. Is this what you're asking me, Heather, by the way?
Yes, I am. How can you submit to this project?
Right,
Yep.
so you'll get to this form. The form has a little introduction. It tells you very clearly that there's all sorts of material that we're gathering. So, you know, we could add into this list of personal stories, poems, other expressions, you know, writings for children, or creative prayers, or audience reflections, or audience responses. And then you go through, you put in your email, and then you write down which types of responses you're submitting. You know, if you might start with a local congregation, right? You might start with a local religious community. And in that community, they might have sermons, they might have pronouncements, they might have prayers. I saw a church that gathered together a wall of, I'm not sure what you'd call it, but like personal statements, right? That they took picture of, they put it on their website. So you can have a variety of materials. You can have pronouncements of Jewish law. I've seen a lot of those. So you could submit from the same, say, house of worship, 5 different documents at a time. You could check those off here. You'd put in the URL, the, whatever the internet address of the website that you got the data from, and then you'd upload it here where it says add files, and then you put in the bibliographic information. Now we also ask for religious affiliation. This is the system we have right now. We're hoping to improve this. You don't actually have to know. So if you found some interesting preacher out there, you think he or she is Methodist, or you think he or she is Baptist, but you're not sure, or they're Jewish, but you don't know where in Judaism they're coming from, you could put it here. I noticed that some of my students found Messianic Jews, and they labeled them under Judaism, and that was a little bit of a controversial issue right there. But we do ask people, if you can help us identify it, that'd be great. And then at the end, oh, it still says, let me change this. Then at the end, we leave you space to put in a statement of your own. So this is something that all of you guys, all of you folks could do today. You could put in a statement of 2,000 words, 2,000 characters, excuse me. And that's actually the last field, but it would be an opportunity for you to write a reflection about how you're experiencing the relation of religion and the pandemic. So this is the main sort of entry point for the project. Please go ahead.
I want to make the institutional plug. I think one of the things that I'm interested in as a historian who has benefited from studying in archives, I think that the creation of this is really, really important. And if there are ICJS connected folks who are on the call today, I think if you could tag your submission as coming from ICJS, then we would have our sort of own field in the archive, and when it becomes publicly available, it could be useful long term. So where is that part of it?
That would be right here in the second to last question. Who or what may be credited with this contribution? So I think right now, if you just put in like hashtag ICJS or just ICJS, we'll be able to search that field and add it to the metadata, the background data for the documents or the story that you're telling. So that, yeah, that would be a very good way for us to be able to track who's contributing things. I was just talking to somebody the other day about their organizational's input as well. And we want to be able to track people's contributions so that later scholars can figure out how it is that all these items ended up in this database together.
Yeah. That's great. And did you want to, I'm just conscious of the time. We have a little less than 20 minutes left. I want to let you share your examples if you wanted to of the sort of range of sermons that are coming in, and then we'll maybe reserve the rest of the time for audience questions.
Sure, that might be fun. When I was talking to Heather, around the time I was talking to Heather, you know, you guys are based in Baltimore, right?
Correct.
So I thought, okay, I'm going to go search for something interesting in Baltimore. So, so I did find something interesting, and I just wanted to bring to your attention, if you can see on the screen here, this quote from Hebrews 10:25, which I'm not going to read. Well, should I read? Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves, right? So it has to do with religious people assembling together. And so what you can find, if you've done an analysis of a big archive like this, you might find all sorts of materials that quote this verse. And you'll be able to see the diversity of religious responses to the pandemic through the lens of interpreting this particular piece of scripture. So, so one example of this was from a, oh, actually, let me just show you this on our database here. So this is a little demo that I put together for ICGS, and I started to collect some materials and different kinds of responses. So there is this interesting blog post. Is this big enough for you to see, Heather?
I think so. Maybe if you could zoom in another click or two. There, that's good.
So she says, I came up in a Black church where there were few things as repulsive as forsaking the assembly, giving up the opportunity to be together as a church, a practice that's derived from the New Testament, from Hebrews 10:25. And she talks about the importance of assembling, but then later on she talks about she has photos of, later on she talks about the importance of also observing the public health guidance. So she quotes people who believe that the churches should still be meeting, but she herself takes the argument, no, that our health and safety are more important. And then I found a different example from somebody who you might recognize from Baltimore, Stacy Shiflett. And this also gives you an opportunity to see how the interns and the students will be working with a tool that allows them to analyze the data. I entered in this piece, well, this is part of a much longer sermon, but I entered in about a 1-minute section, and it transcribed it for me automatically very quickly. And then I added in these codes over here to start to analyze this. And it included, even though he didn't say it, I could tell that he was, I certainly don't know scripture by heart, but I could tell that he was making an implicit or a uncited reference. Oh, Ben Sachs, aren't you an expert on citations? He cited scripture without telling you the scripture source. And so I picked it up, and I happened to know it was Hebrews 10. So let's hear this thing, and you'll see how the transcript matches the speaker, and you'll also see what a great example this is of people at different sides taking an approach towards the key issue of what to do about public health. So his church was giving a cease and desist order to not continue meeting for the sake of public health.
So newsflash, Pharaoh doesn't get to dictate to God's people how they worship their God. God's the one that defines the parameters. God's the one that communicates his will and his plan for his church, not Egypt. And I'm telling you right now, with this cease and desist letter in my hand, the Bible says to the New Testament church, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some is, but so much the more as you see the day approaching. And the closer we get to Jesus coming back, the more church we ought to be having, not less church. Now that's God's parameters. So I'm tearing up this cease and desist order right here, and I'm telling you right now, we're going to do it God's way. We're going to do it God's way. God tells us how to worship him. Nobody else gets to do that.
Thank you for sharing that. I think just to restate, I think one of the things that's so incredible about this project, it probably just needs to be stated out loud, is that there's not one religious response to this moment, that there are so many diverse religious responses to this moment, and diverse religious responses that can cite the exact same line of scripture and land in entirely different places. And your goal, just to be clear, is to collect everything, right?
And it also helps put it in context when you see, 500 preachers and 5 of them are doing things one way and 450 are doing things another way. It helps you put it in context. The news media, I think, has been very effective at ferreting out some of the most controversial materials. And sometimes they, will take a little snippet and we need to get the entire material to put it in context. But they're not necessarily collecting and bringing attention to all sorts of other groups that are out there. So for instance, Alexa, and I believe Veronica too, are actually studying a fairly small network of primitive Baptist churches, which has never been reported in the news media about this. And we want to understand, how is this particular group handling it? So yes, so we're looking for the breadth and sort of the diversity of religious responses. Please.
All right, let's look back to some questions that are coming in. So again, we're inviting everyone to submit to this project, and the links are in the chat and will also come out in the follow-up email. Here are some other questions from the audience. Have you been looking what's available on YouTube? And do you want materials from there that we use in liturgies? This is probably from a religious leader or a clergy person who's joining us today.
Yes, absolutely. If you personally could get us the sermon in writing or your outline notes, we would love to have that as well. We want you to submit it with your permission. Of course, I don't think you should go to some preacher's desk and steal their outline. but it would be great to get the background notes to some of these live stream recordings. But just the other day, in preparation for this talk, when I put up that material I showed you, I took a series of YouTube sermons and I downloaded it right into the system, and then immediately spit out a transcript. But it'd be interesting to compare what the preacher said to their actual, say, written sermon as well. So yeah, so any kind of sermon, any kind of religious pronouncement that you can get on YouTube, or any kind of commentary, individual commentaries, there are some programs that are, I find, pretty easy to use, and I'm an amateur, that allows you to download videos from YouTube. And we can put those right into the database.
This is another question from the audience. Are there any religious groups that you would like to see more materials from that are underrepresented so far?
I mean, there isn't any particular religious group that we don't want to see materials from, but I certainly think there are many that are underreported and underrepresented. They might have fewer resources. They might be ignored. People might just, the mainstream press that we see, well, maybe, I guess it depends on who we is. So, yeah, I'm not sure I'm speaking for everyone. But so, for instance, one of my students wants to study Korean churches. So in the media that I read, there is not a lot of reporting about what's happening with the Korean churches and the pandemic. Now, I suppose there is Asian American media out there that does cover this, but I don't happen to be a reader of it. So all these communities, I think, are worth pursuing. And the interns this summer, they're each choosing a, one of my interns is Nas. I don't know, Nas, if you want to say something, but you're sort of thinking about who you want to cover. Do you want to just say a little bit about what your thought process is in deciding which groups to look at?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everybody. So I have been working in the Jewish Studies Department at University of California, Davis for the last year or so. And I'm looking to kind of branch out a little bit more into some other, I'm very curious about just religion and faith in general. My focus is commemoration, memorialization, and faith disseminated through technology. So I'm very curious personally about how Catholic high schools are dealing with not only trying to organize a curriculum, but keep faith maintained in their students as well. So I'm sort of narrowing it down by location right now, and I'm looking to probably do Pennsylvania, but I'd like to maybe further the focus even more so if I can.
Yeah. So, why wouldn't we want to understand what the high schools are doing? And, what kind of religious group wouldn't we want to try to understand? One of the other interns is with Christian Science. And as people may know, Christian Science is a group that has controversial positions on medicine, and they tend to be stigmatized for their approach, and they're going to be even more stigmatized during a health crisis like this pandemic. And I think it's very powerful and maybe courageous of her to want to collect that data and put that forward in an unapologetic way, not as a proponent, not as an advocate, but just for the sake of historical understanding. So I think there are all sorts of religious groups that we should be not stigmatizing, not ignoring, and just trying to understand. And they may not be very flashy. They might not be very flashy, but I think they're worth understanding.
Here's a couple other questions about your research methods, or your collection methods. Collection methods is a better category. How are you determining the codes?
Oh, all right. Well, I think you and I should have a long conversation about this. This is a really big question in the social sciences, and some of them are very deductive in their approach, some of them are very inductive, and I've tried some of both. When I have an introductory course, I tend to start off with a group of categories that I'm giving the students directly. when I have a more advanced student, like NAS is a more advanced student, or the scholar who's doing the Brazilian Pentecostal churches, they will do something more inductive, I think. They will be reading the materials and looking for the wording and the concepts that are emerging from within the text or within the audio. And they will be coding from the ground up. When I showed you that list of codes on the screen earlier that Veronica was around, say punishment, is the virus of punishment. We got that list partly by first analyzing news articles. Okay, so that's a very sort of top-down approach. But in the social sciences in general, it's often inductive. I hope this is answering your question, by the way.
It is, it is. Do you want to say a little bit more about inductive versus deductive for those who are outside of the guild, as it were?
Sure. I mean, you have a very inductive group right here, right? But go ahead. That's great.
Yeah, no, so it just to restate again, kind of an inductive method is when you're looking at a body of literature and then you're pulling the categories from consuming a lot of the materials. Deductive is that you're going in and you're looking for punishment as a term, and then you're trying to collect that way. So sort of a simplistic way of framing it, but it sounds like you're doing a kind of a combination to get to the codes.
Well, I do want to explain that the project of I think we've both been clear on this for folks, that the project to archive and preserve all this historical record is really sort of an urgent data collection process, right? I'm not imposing a particular analytical approach through this project, but my students, when I have a course, they're going to be using this archive. And so then I am teaching them particular methodologies, but other scholars are going to be able to come in and use whatever methodology they want, and the public as well. When you contribute the data, if you tell your story and other people you find are telling their story, you'll then have access to all of those together. And you can read them or analyze them however you want.
You made reference to working with George Mason and with the Library of Congress. There's some questions coming in about access to this and other institutions who are also doing collecting, and sort of what are your hopes and what are your relationships with those other possible partners?
Well, I'm in a small Midwestern university, and we sort of got the jump on this and we gathered a lot of information, but there are universities with more resources than us, and we're partnering up with George Mason. They have a really great digital humanities program. And there are going to be other institutions also partnering up in a website that contains these various archiving efforts. And I'm reaching out to other groups as well. So we are trying to, in some ways, pool our resources. I don't know that we'll ever merge. Mm-hmm. The data will, I think, mostly be available to the public, but for copyright issues or for privacy issues, other issues, there may be some layers of information that's only going to be accessible to, say, scholars or to other people who are getting permission to look at it on a different kind of basis.
Do you have a sense of when and where access might be in the future, or is it just really just actively collecting right now?
Well, actually, we have one of our librarians are on the phone right now, and I wanted to show you I want to show you like a prototype of what the database would look like, if that would be useful.
Oh, that would be.
Is this what you're asking me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's a prototype that Matt put together. It allows you, for instance, to look at different faith communities, might be organized by denomination or by branch, different types of collections. You might have a section on sermons. You'll have a browse or a search function. This happens to be a section of video excerpts. So this is just a very small prototype of what will eventually be a more complete website. We hope to get that out in the next couple of weeks. So we're pretty excited about that. Other kinds of questions?
I think one more, again, thinking about submissions.
Sure.
is there a bright line between a religious response versus a personal response of someone who may be in a religious community?
Not for my purpose. I mean, certainly there are going to be people who come in and say, I want to study the LDS Church, the Latter-day Saints. And when I study that church, I only want to look at the official documents, right? So if there's a scholar who comes in and does that, they will find those official documents. Another scholar might come in and say, I want to find all the Mormons and the ex-Mormons or the lapsed Mormons or the Mormons on the edge, and I want to read all the things that they went through during this crisis. Show me their diaries, show me their journal entries, show me their blog posts. So it'd be great to get a range of those materials together for people who come at it with different angles.
So you're very capacious in your collecting and your goals for this. I just want to thank you, Hillel, for taking on this really important work. I want to encourage everyone on the call to submit to this project. In addition to this call, right, you can right now get off the call and you can submit something right away if you're interested, or do that casually. But if for folks who may be interested in taking a more active role, there is a volunteer opportunity to do so and to get a little bit more involved in this project.
But we would love to have volunteers. We would love to have a stringer in every neighborhood finding what their local mosque or church or synagogue is doing and submitting materials. Just walk down the street to your neighbor. Don't get too close, but give them a notebook, let them write up their impressions, take a photo of it and submit it. There are all sorts of things that people could do. And if there are volunteers who really want to put a little bit of time into it, we have a whole group of people now who are happy to train you and sort of draw you into this fascinating project. You might be stuck at home temporarily, but there's a lot you could do to contribute to the understanding of what's going on.
Well, thank you very much, Hillel and Naz and Alexa and Veronica, for telling us about this important work and for collecting. I also want to say if ICJS folks do take that step to please mark in the comment section the ICJS, and so we have our own kind of file folder in this potential archive of ways that we contributed to this important project. It is a little bit after 5, and so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There's another opportunity coming up on Tuesday, June 9th. We'll be having a conversation with Dr. Larisha Hawkins. She was faculty Christian. She's a Christian professor from Wheaton College who in 2015 decided to put on hijab in solidarity with Muslim women who were suffering from Islamophobia. And there's a documentary film out about her experience. You can watch the film on either Amazon, Google Play, or iTunes at home, and then join me for a conversation with Dr. Larisha Hawkins on Tuesday, June 9th at 4 p.m. The link will be dropped in the chat. It's also available at our website. I just want to give Hillel the last word and ask one final question. What is one thing, as a scholar of religion, what's one thing you wished everyone knew about the study of religion?
Was I supposed to prepare for this question?
Better if it's extemporaneous.
You know, I think there's so much unexpected. I think we come into this with so many preconceptions that we think we understand how other people's minds are working, and there's so little that we know. And that if you open yourself up to really listening to people or really reading them carefully, and you get outside of your own mindset, I think it's a very powerful experience. I don't know if it's a religious experience, but it's a very powerful learning experience to be able to pay attention to different religious people.
Well, Hillel, thank you for many years of friendship and collegiality, and I am delighted to see that your good humor is still intact. I'm, a little sad that your rhyming was not evident today, but I feel like we could invite you back for a poetic refrains at a future date. So.
This is really great. It's a really great group. I'm happy to hang around a little bit if that's helpful, but it's just wonderful. It's wonderful to see some of the comments in the chat as well. And I do thank my interns this summer. They're putting so much time and so much effort into it. So Heather, thank you. And thanks to your fellow scholars and staff at ICGS.
Thank you.